The cold night and the curious discovery. The storm had not announced itself the way most storms did. There had been no slow darkening of the afternoon sky, no gradual thickening of clouds that gave a seasoned traveler enough warning to find proper shelter or lash down his supplies. This one had simply arrived, sudden and absolute, dropping over the Ashfin Mountains like a curtain being yanked shut on the last remaining light of the world. One moment the evening had been cold but manageable, the stars just beginning to show themselves through a thin layer of high cloud. The next, the wind had come screaming down from the northern ridgeline with a voice like something ancient and furious, and the temperature had plummeted so fast that the breath fogging from Edric's mouth had turned to tiny crystals before it even fully left his lips. He had made his camp quickly, with the efficient, unhurried movements of a man who had been caught in worse and survived all of it. 23 years of wandering the wild places between towns had stripped every unnecessary motion from his habits, leaving only what worked. He had chosen the base of an ancient pine, one of the great ones, wide enough that three men linking hands could not have encompassed its trunk, for the way its massive root system created a natural hollow against the ground, partially sheltered from the wind. He had laid his bedroll in that hollow, weighted the corners of his oilskin tarp with the heaviest stones he could find nearby, and wrapped his wool blanket around himself with the practiced tightness of someone who knew the difference between merely covered and actually insulated. The forest around him had gone strange and loud all at once. The pine's canopy was thrashing overhead with a sound like the ocean, each gust sending cascades of ice-crusted needles raining down through the dark. Somewhere off to his left, a branch gave way under the wind's pressure and fell with a crash that startled a roosting bird into shrieking flight. The campfire he had managed to coax to life between two sheltering roots was fighting bravely, flattening itself nearly horizontal with each gust before springing back upright with a determination that Edric found quietly admirable. He had fed it carefully, not too much at once, building its base into something stubborn enough to endure. He had eaten cold dried meat and a heel of hard bread washed down with water from his flask that had already begun to carry the faint taste of near freezing. A proper meal was not an option tonight, not with the wind threatening to snatch any open flame the moment he attempted to heat anything. He had eaten without complaint, because complaining required an audience, and Edric had long since made peace with his own company. He chewed slowly, watched the fire wrestle with the wind, and listened to the forest voice its distress all around him. By the time he settled back against the root and closed his eyes, the cold had deepened into something serious. It was the kind of cold that crept under wool and burrowed against skin, that made the joints in his hands ache with a dull, insistent throb and turned the tip of his nose into something he could no longer fully feel. He pulled the blanket tighter, tucked his chin down, and focused on the warmth his own body was generating and trapping against the bedroll beneath him. It was enough. It had to be enough. He had slept in worse. He was perhaps 10 minutes from actual sleep, that drifting, half-conscious place where thoughts lose their edges and the body finally releases the tension it's been holding all day, when he felt it. A pressure small, deliberate, against his ribs on the left side through the blanket. He did not startle. Startling was a luxury of people who had not yet learned that sudden reactions in the dark wilderness were more likely to cause harm than prevent it. Instead, every muscle in his body simply went very still, the deep, listening stillness of a man taking stock. His eyes stayed closed for another 3 seconds while he processed the sensation. It was not sharp, not the jab of a stick or root he had somehow missed when clearing his bedroll. It was soft, rounded. It pressed and then withdrew slightly, then pressed again, tentative in a way that suggested intention. Something alive. Something small. Then another pressure, this one lower near his hip, slightly heavier, slightly more insistent. He opened one eye. He did it the way he did most things, slowly, deliberately, with the minimum amount of motion necessary for the task. Just the one eye barely a crack, the other remaining closed so as not to broadcast full wakefulness to whatever was out there. He did not move his head. He let his vision adjust to the firelight and the dark, blinking once, twice, until the shapes at the edge of his blanket came into focus. For a long moment, his mind simply did not know what to do with what it was seeing. They were small. That was the first thing, the overwhelming, immediate, almost disorienting fact of how small they were. He had seen kittens fresh from the litter that were larger. Nestled at the very edge of where his blanket met the forest floor, pushing out from between the gnarled roots and the dark undergrowth behind them, were two creatures unlike anything his rational brain wanted to immediately accept. His eyes registered the details one at a time, as if processing them in sequence was the only way to keep up. Scales, small, tight, perfectly formed scales the deep blue-gray of storm clouds caught just before they open. They covered every visible inch of the creatures, except for the soft, paler skin he could see along the undersides of their necks, skin that looked tender and cold, almost translucent in the firelight, faintly showing the tracery of veins beneath. The scales caught the firelight in tiny glimmers, not quite a shimmer, more like the way wet stone catches light, deep and muted and beautiful in spite of themselves. Wings, folded tight and close against their backs, the way a butterfly holds itself in the rain, not spread, not functional, just present and bedraggled, the membrane between the delicate bones dark with moisture, pressed flat from cold and use and whatever ordeal had brought them here. Too small to use, too new for that. The bone structure was visible through the thin membrane, delicate as the finest lacework, and he could see that the primary joint was barely developed, the whole apparatus clearly not more than a day or two old. Faces, this was where his mind finally stopped bargaining with itself and simply accepted the truth of what he was looking at. The faces were unmistakable, not mammalian, not reptilian in any ordinary sense, but something that sat at the impossible intersection of both and neither. The snouts were short and blunt with youth, the jaw structure not yet settled into the long, angular severity it would eventually become. The brow ridges were soft, barely pronounced. Two tiny nostrils flared at the end of each snout, and Edric could see the faintest wisps of condensed air curling from them with each rapid, frightened breath. And the eyes. He had not expected the eyes to affect him the way they did. They were enormous, wildly disproportionate to the small faces that held them, the way young things so often are, as if the eyes arrive fully grown while the rest of the creature slowly catches up. Amber. Not the pale, washed-out amber of common stones, but deep, rich, liquid amber, the color of old honey held up to afternoon sun, the color of something precious and warm preserved in time. They were fixed on him with an expression so complex and so nakedly readable that it struck him somewhere beneath the chest. Desperate need, yes, that was the loudest thing, a shivering animal need for warmth that overrode every instinct telling them to flee. But beneath it, wound through it like a thread, uncertainty, wariness. The trembling, terrible courage of a creature that has made a decision it is not entirely sure was wise, and has committed to it anyway because the alternative was worse. Dragon hatchlings. The thought arrived in his mind not with the shock he might have expected, but with a strange, quiet certainty as if some part of him had known before the rest of him caught up. Dragon hatchlings. Newly hatched, he was near enough sure of that now. The wings too wet and underdeveloped, the scales still holding that faint luminescence of freshness, the bodies lacking the settled musculature that even a week of life would begin to build. Somewhere above him, high on the Ashfin ridgeline, there was a nest. And somewhere beyond that nest, a mother. He thought of what he knew, which was not nothing. Herbalists who wandered the mountain territories learned quickly that knowledge was survival, and knowledge of the apex creatures that shared those territories was the most critical knowledge of all. Dragon mothers of the mountain breeds, the Ashfin line in particular, identifiable by exactly that storm-cloud coloring, laid clutches of between 2 and 5 eggs in deep, geothermally warmed rock nests during early winter. They left those nests for days at a time to hunt, trusting the natural heat of the mountain stone to maintain the temperature the eggs and hatchlings required. Under normal conditions, this worked. The rock held warmth the way good pottery held heat, slow to gain it and slow to release it. But this storm had been neither slow nor ordinary. It had come from the north, from beyond the high passes, carrying the genuine cold of somewhere much further and much crueler than the Ashfin Range. A cold that would have stolen the warmth from even deep rock in a matter of hours. He could picture it, the nest going cold, the hatchlings inside growing sluggish and frightened, the instinct that the warmth had gone wrong driving them out into the open despite everything that should have kept them sheltered and still. And then in the dark and the howling wind, one tiny nose lifting to catch the faint, improbable thread of something warm. His campfire, small and stubborn and real. They had followed it through the storm. Newly hatched, wings useless, barely able to walk, and they had followed the thread of warmth through the dark mountain forest until it led them here, to this bedroll, to this blanket, to this man they had no reason to trust and every instinct telling them to fear. And yet here they were. The larger of the two, marginally, perhaps half an inch longer in the body, the scales very slightly darker, had been the one to make first contact. It was this one whose small, clawed foot had pressed against his ribs with that testing pressure, and it was this one that now held its ground rather than retreating, even with his eye open and his wakefulness revealed. It was watching him with an intensity that almost made him want to look away. Its head was lowered slightly in a posture he recognized. Not submission, not aggression, something in between. The posture of a creature holding itself very carefully at the edge of a decision it hadn't yet committed to. Then it made its sound. He would think about that sound later, in the way you think about things that catch you off guard and lodge somewhere between memory and feeling. It came from somewhere deep in the small chest, a sound that wanted to be multiple things at once and couldn't quite settle on any of them. There was the high, bright thread of a bird's chirp in it, the kind of sound that means I am here, I am small, please acknowledge me, and wound beneath that, insistent and incongruous coming from something so tiny, the low, chest-resonant beginning of a growl. Not a threat. Nothing about this creature at this moment in this cold had the luxury of threat. But the growl was there the way a backbone is there, structural, essential, a reminder of what this small thing was and would become. I am asking, the sound said, but I am not begging. It placed one foot on his blanket. The claw was the size of his thumbnail. The leg it was attached to was trembling, visibly, undeniably trembling, whether from cold or from the enormous effort of holding still under the weight of his gaze, he couldn't say. Probably both. The foot pressed down into the wool with a careful, testing pressure, feeling the texture, feeling the warmth trapped within it, and the amber eyes never left his face. Waiting. Edric was not a man who made a great deal of noise about his feelings. This was a personality trait that had developed early and calcified over 23 years of solitary wandering into something closer to a defining characteristic. He did not exclaim. He did not make speeches. When things moved him, and things did move him, more often than the quiet exterior suggested, it showed up in small ways. A slight deepening of the lines around his eyes, a breath held a half-second longer than necessary, the way his hands would go very gentle without him consciously deciding to make them gentle. What moved through him now, looking at this small, storm-drenched, trembling creature standing at the edge of his blanket with one foot placed and its whole body a question mark, what moved through him was something he didn't try to name. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as tenderness and wonder and the particular ache of recognizing courage in a small thing. He felt it move through his chest and settle somewhere quiet. He thought about the cold. He thought about the nest gone cold on the ridgeline and the long, desperate stumble through the dark and the courage it had taken, though courage was perhaps too large a word for an instinct this fundamental, and yet he couldn't call it anything less, the courage it had taken to approach something large and unknown when the only other option was the cold. He did not say anything. Words felt wrong, too large, too sudden, too human in a moment that required something quieter. He did not reach for them, did not make the mistake of trying to express with his voice what he could express far more clearly with the simplest possible action. He smiled. It started at the corners of his eyes before it reached his mouth, the way real smiles do, the kind that come from somewhere actual rather than somewhere performed. It was slow, unhurried, the smile of a man who was genuinely, uncomplicatedly glad to see something, despite the cold and the storm and the burned hole in his carefully maintained sleep schedule. It was warm in the way that firelight is warm, not blazing, not theatrical, just steady and real and present. And then, holding that gaze, he reached down and took the edge of his blanket between two fingers. He lifted it. Not quickly, not with any flourish. He simply raised the edge of the wool slowly upward, creating an opening, a gap between the warmth inside and the cold outside, a space that was an invitation so plain it required no interpretation in any language, human or otherwise. The warm air that had been trapped against his body rolled out from underneath in a gentle wave, visible for just a moment as a pale shimmer in the cold. It carried his body heat, the faint smell of wood smoke and dried herbs and wool, the accumulated warmth of a living thing that had been breathing and existing in this small space for the better part of an hour. The amber eyes dropped to the opening, then back to his face, then back to the opening. The smaller one, which had been hanging back slightly, the same deep storm gray as the first but fractionally smaller, less bold, its posture telegraphing every ounce of its uncertainty, pressed slightly forward at the sight of the warmth. Edric could see its nostrils working, reading the air that was spilling out, processing the heat and the scent and the information contained in both. He held the blanket edge up and waited perfectly still, the smile remaining not frozen into something artificial, but simply there, resting on his face the way it had settled, patient as the pine at his back. He had learned patience the way most people learn their most important lessons, slowly, through necessity, through the gradual accumulation of experiences that demonstrated what happened when you rushed things. You rushed a nervous animal and it fled, and you lost whatever chance you'd had. You rushed a delicate plant extraction and destroyed the root system, and the medicine was lost. You rushed a moment that needed stillness, and the moment was gone. He did not rush this. The wind screamed overhead. The fire bent and recovered, bent and recovered. The cold pressed in from everywhere the blanket did not cover, and at the edge of that small circle of warmth, two impossibly small creatures stood in the dark and made their decision. The larger one moved first, a single committed step forward, then another, then a small scrambling climb over the ridge of his leg where it lay beneath the blanket, claws catching in the wool for purchase, wings half spreading instinctively for balance before tucking back down. It disappeared beneath the edge of the blanket with a rustling urgency, and he felt it immediately, that small, cold weight pressing against his side, burrowing toward the warmest point with single-minded determination, the tiny body shaking against him in a way that would, he understood, stop shaking soon. The second followed within seconds, less graceful, tumbling slightly at the lip of the blanket before finding its footing, making a sound that might have been indignation at its own clumsiness before it too disappeared beneath the wool and pressed itself against the first. Edric lowered the blanket edge gently. He lay still for a long moment, feeling the small movements beneath the wool, the shifting, the pressing, the working for warmth that was both deeply animal and somehow unutterably endearing. He felt the cold of them against his side beginning very slowly to yield. He felt the trembling, which had been almost constant since he first saw them, beginning, not stopping, not yet, but beginning to quiet. He stared up at the underside of the tarp above him, listening to the storm continue its tantrum over the mountain, and he felt the smile still sitting on his face in the dark, where no one could see it but him. He reached down with the careful deliberateness of a man moving around something fragile and adjusted his arm so that it curved gently around the outside of the blanket, not gripping, not constraining, just present. A gentle perimeter. A quiet signal that the warmth was not going anywhere, and neither was he. He did not think about what this meant, or what tomorrow would bring, or the considerable logistical complications of waking up with dragon hatchlings in his bedroll in the shadow of the Ashfin Mountains. Those were morning thoughts, and morning was still hours away. Tonight there was the storm and the fire and the warmth held close, and that was enough. He closed his eyes. He was nearly asleep, properly, deeply asleep this time, when he heard it. From somewhere behind the mossy root 3 feet to his left, barely audible beneath the howl of the wind, a sound, smaller than the others had made. Higher. The clicking, chattering sound of something very small and very cold, teeth or scales or some combination of both, trembling in the dark. A third. His eyes opened. He did not sigh, he did not calculate. He simply turned his head toward the sound, toward the root and the darkness behind it, and he lifted the edge of the blanket again, and he waited, and he smiled. The warmth between a man and small wild things. They crawled in with all the graceless urgency of creatures who had been cold for far too long. There was nothing elegant about it, nothing of the mythic grandeur that the old stories attached to dragons, the terrible majesty, the sovereign power, the sense of something vast and ancient moving through the world on its own incomprehensible terms. There was only cold, and the desperate animal need to not be cold anymore, and the blanket that promised relief from it. The larger of the two already inside was pressed so hard against Edric's ribs that he could feel each individual scale through the wool. A tiny tessellated pressure that shifted and adjusted as the creature burrowed deeper, seeking the warmest point with the single-minded focus of something that has reduced its entire existence, for this moment, to one simple equation. Find warmth, stay in warmth, do not leave warmth. The second was less directed about it. It had tumbled in after the first with a kind of controlled chaos, claws catching in the blanket weave, one wing half spreading in a reflexive bid for balance before folding back down, a tail that seemed to operate on a slightly different agenda than the rest of the body, and swung wide enough to briefly catch Edric across the wrist with a touch that was cool and smooth and startling in its smallness. It found a position eventually, wedged between its sibling and the curve of Edric's stomach, and it pressed itself there with a firmness that suggested it had no intention of moving until the temperature of the world outside changed substantially. He lay still through all of it. He was good at stillness. It was perhaps the most useful skill 23 years of wandering had given him, more valuable than his knowledge of plants or weather patterns or the geography of mountain passes. The ability to become, temporarily, something that was not a threat, to make the body quiet enough that nervous things forgot to be nervous of it. He kept his breathing slow and even, his arm resting loose rather than gripping, his presence offered without being imposed. He was thinking about the third. The sound had been coming from behind the mossy root for several minutes now, had probably been coming from there longer than that if he was honest, hidden beneath the wind and the general noise of the storm. Now that he was listening for it specifically, it was unmistakable. The chattering, clicking, rhythmic tremble of something very small in the grip of cold it had been enduring alone. There was a quality to it that sat uneasily in his chest, not distress in any communicative sense, not a call for help in the way that animal distress calls usually functioned. It was more involuntary than that, more fundamental. The sound a body makes when it is fighting to hold itself together against something larger than itself, when the shaking has gone beyond the point where the creature controls it and becomes simply what the creature is doing now, whether it wants to be or not. He turned his head toward the root carefully, so as not to disturb the two already tucked against him, and he looked into the dark space behind it. He could see the eyes first. Of course he could, eyes that large caught light the way a mirror caught light, and even the low, wind-battered fire threw enough illumination to find them. They were the same amber as the others, that deep honey gold, but where the other two had held their fear alongside a visible, functional courage, these eyes held something quieter and more defeated. They were not calculating whether to approach. They were not poised at the edge of a decision. They were simply present in the dark, watching him with the dull, exhausted wariness of a creature that has been frightened for so long that the fear has flattened out into something more like endurance. This one was smaller than the others. Noticeably so, not marginally smaller in the way the second was smaller than the first, but genuinely substantially smaller in the way that the last hatch sometimes is, the one that got less of whatever resource the others claimed first. Its scales were different too. Where the first two wore the deep storm cloud gray that marked the Ashvin line, this one was pale. Silver, not the silver of polished metal, not bright or reflective, but the silver of birch bark in winter light, of frost on dark stone just before the sun reaches it. Muted and delicate and faintly luminous in a way that the gray of the others was not, as if the pale scales held the cold light rather than absorbing it. It was shaking hard enough that he could see it from where he lay, and he had heard its teeth or its scales, some part of its small body, clicking together in that rapid, involuntary percussion before he had even confirmed its location. He moved slowly. He always moved slowly when it mattered. He extracted his right arm from beneath the edge of the blanket with the careful deliberateness of a surgeon, no sudden movements, no jostle to the two already settled against him, just a gradual, quiet emergence of one arm into the cold air. He felt the temperature hit his skin immediately, the outside world announcing itself with the blunt efficiency of winter, and he did not react to it beyond a slight tightening of his jaw, which he then consciously relaxed. He extended his arm toward the root, toward the silver one in the dark behind it. He turned his palm upward. This was something he had done hundreds of times in his years on the mountain roads, with injured foxes, with lost fawns, with a young hawk once that had flown into a cliff face in a storm not entirely unlike this one and sat dazed and furious in the snow while he approached it with his palm up and his voice low, and his whole body arranged into something that said, "I am not the worst thing that has happened to you today." The upturned palm was a language older than words. It said, "Look, no grip, no trap, nothing closed, nothing reaching." It said, "This is what I have and I am offering it and you do not have to take it." He waited. The silver one's eyes moved from his face to his hand and back again. Its nostrils worked. He could see that even in the dark, the tiny flare and close of them processing the information in the air. Warmth, wood smoke, dried herbs from the satchel beside him. The particular complex scent of a human that had been living outdoors for weeks, which was to say, something animal, something lived in, something that carried in its layers the record of every forest and mountain pass it had moved through. He wondered what that scent said to a creature newly emerged into a world it had no map for. He hoped it said not a predator. He hoped it said warm. The clicking of the teeth or scales slowed fractionally, then resumed, then slowed again. He did not move the hand, did not press forward, did not withdraw it, did not adjust. He held it exactly where it was and kept his eyes soft, not averted, because averted eyes could read as dismissal or disinterest, and this creature needed to see that he was present and attending, but not hard either, not the focused predator gaze that put animals on edge. The middle place. The place that said, "I see you, and I am not alarmed by you, and I am not going anywhere." The silver one leaned its head forward. The movement was infinitesimal at first, a fraction of an inch tentative beyond expression, as if the creature was testing whether the air between it and the hand was safe before committing any more of itself to the journey. Then another fraction. Then a pause so long that Edric's arm began to complain quietly about holding its position in the cold, and he ignored it entirely. Then the nose touched his fingers. It was cold. Of course it was cold. The creature had been sitting in winter air for however long it had been sitting there, and every surface of it had taken on the temperature of the world around it. But it was also unmistakably alive. The specific concentrated aliveness of a small creature investigating something with the organ best suited for investigation, drawing information in rapid little breaths, the nostrils flaring against the pad of his middle finger, and then the base of his thumb, and then moving carefully to the back of his hand as if conducting a thorough audit. He felt the warmth of each exhaled breath against his skin in small, quick pulses. He held absolutely still and let it work. The process took longer than he expected and less time than he feared. Whatever the small nose found in its investigation, it apparently constituted a passing grade. The silver one pulled back for a moment, looked at him once more with those exhausted amber eyes, and then made its decision in the way that animals make decisions, not with visible deliberation, but with a sudden, complete commitment that bypassed the hesitation entirely and simply became action. It stepped forward on legs that shook with each placement, each small foot finding purchase on the uneven forest floor with an effortful care that made something in his chest ache quietly. It walked the remaining distance to his hand and then stood in his palm and was simply there, a small silver weight no heavier than a good-sized river stone, its whole body still trembling against his skin with that rapid, involuntary rhythm. Edric closed his fingers. Not around it, not a grip, nothing constraining, just a gentle curl of his fingers upward on either side of the small body. A cupping, a surrounding. He brought his hand in from the cold and tucked it against his chest inside the blanket, and he felt the silver one press itself immediately and completely into the warmth with a total, surrendering relief that communicated more clearly than anything else could have how long it had been cold. and how much it had cost to be cold for that long. The two already pressed against his side stirred briefly at the new arrival. There was a moment of adjustment, of small bodies shifting and repositioning, tails and elbows and the blunt, rounded ends of folded wings all making competing claims on the available space. The larger one lifted its head and regarded the silver newcomer with amber eyes that were beginning, finally, to show the first signs of warmth in them. The pupils widening slightly, the tension around the brow ridge releasing incrementally, before it settled again and pressed closer rather than away, as if making room was simply the obvious thing to do. Then the real chaos began. He had anticipated the settling, had rather expected that once they were warm and still they would simply stay warm and still. He had underestimated the specific character of young, cold-recovered, newly curious creatures with no established framework for what a human was or what the proper behavior around one should be. Once the immediate desperation of the cold began to ease, and it eased faster than he would have guessed, the shared body heat beneath the blanket building with a surprising efficiency. Something else came online in the three small bodies arranged against him. Something that was not quite curiosity and not quite restlessness, but lived somewhere between both, powered by the same abundant, inefficient energy that all young things possessed in quantities that made their elders tired just to observe. The larger one moved first naturally. It had been the decisive one from the beginning, and it applied that decisiveness now to the project of thoroughly investigating its current situation. It pushed itself upright against his side and began a systematic exploration of the territory immediately available to it, which was to say, Edric. One small claw found the front of his coat and tested it, pulling at the weave with a focused interest that suggested it was considering the structural integrity of the fabric. The blunt snout pressed against his collarbone, working upward along the side of his neck with the same investigative thoroughness the silver one had applied to his hand. He felt the warm, rapid puffs of exhalation against his jaw and held very still and stared at the tarp above him with an expression of patient, slightly resigned amusement. The second had discovered his arm. Specifically, it had discovered that his arm, lying along the outside of the blanket, was a surface of approximately perfect dimensions for walking along. And it was doing exactly that, placing each foot with the deliberate concentration of a tightrope walker, the tail swinging out for balance with each step, making its way from elbow to wrist with the focused dedication of someone who has found a project and intends to see it through. When it reached his wrist, it stopped, looked at his hand with the evaluating expression of a creature deciding whether to continue onto that surface, apparently decided against it, turned around with considerably less grace than it had deployed on the outward journey, and began the return trip. The silver one had not moved far from his chest, but was doing something he found oddly affecting. It had tucked its chin down over his coat button and was breathing with its eyes half closed, not asleep yet, but arrived at some intermediate state between wakefulness and rest that looked like the specific piece of a creature that has found the thing it needed and is still absorbing the reality of having found it. Its scales had changed slightly in the warmth. The pale silver had taken on a faint, soft luminescence, barely perceptible, like the faintest moonlight caught in still water. He was not sure if he was seeing it accurately or if the firelight was playing tricks, but he found he didn't particularly care which. It was beautiful either way. Then the flame happened. He would reflect later that he probably should have anticipated this, should have factored it into his calculations somewhere between dragon hatchlings and beneath my blanket. The biological fact of it was established even in the general knowledge base of a mountain herbalist. Dragon fire was not a developed skill but a reflex, a physiological function present from hatching, initially uncontrolled and triggered by strong sensation. Cold, surprise, discomfort, and as he now discovered, apparently the specific sensation of warmth flooding back into a previously frozen body after extended deprivation. The larger one had worked its way up to his shoulder. He had been monitoring its progress with the peripheral awareness he was devoting to all three simultaneously, which was to say he was aware of it without being focused on it, the way an experienced rider is aware of the horse without staring at it constantly. So when the small body against his shoulder gave a single, convulsive shudder, not the trembling of cold, but the distinct, involuntary shudder of sudden comfort hitting the nervous system all at once, the physical equivalent of a gasp of relief, he was not watching for what came next, and he had no time to move. Flame was small. He was deeply grateful in the immediate aftermath for how small it was. No larger than a candle flame, as it turned out, a brief, brilliant orange-yellow flicker there and gone in under a second, accompanied by a sound like a single sharp exhalation and a smell of sulfur that cut through the wood smoke cleanly. It caught the shoulder of his coat for just a moment, a tiny circle of wool that glowed orange at its edge before he brushed it out with his free hand in a single, calm motion. The larger hatchling looked at the small char mark with an expression that, if he was reading it correctly, and he was increasingly confident he was developing some ability to read these faces, was one of profound surprise at its own actions. The amber eyes were wide. The head was pulled back on the neck. The whole posture radiated a very specific kind of bewilderment that he recognized from the faces of young things who have done something unexpected and are not yet sure whether it was good or bad. He looked at the small burned circle on his shoulder. He looked at the hatchling. He felt the smile pulling at the corners of his eyes before he'd consciously decided to smile. He was quietly and specifically grateful in that moment for the fact that his beard was grown on his face and not on his shoulder. A different positioning of events, and this encounter might have ended considerably more singed than it did. He made no sound, made no sudden movement, no gesture of reproof or alarm. He simply took the edge of the burned fabric between two fingers, examined it with the mild interest of a man assessing minor property damage, and lowered his hand again. The message he intended, "This is fine, you are fine, we are continuing," appeared to land, because the larger one settled again after a moment, pressing back against his shoulder with a slightly more careful energy than before, as if it had taken the lesson of the flame into some nascent and developing account. The second fell off his arm. Not dramatically. It had been making its third or fourth transit of his forearm when it simply misjudged a step near the elbow, skidded slightly on the wool of his sleeve, and toppled sideways off the edge in a small tumble that deposited it directly onto its sibling, which was still investigating his chest from the other direction. The resulting collision produced a brief, indignant tangle of limbs and tails, and the indistinct, overlapping sounds of two creatures expressing strong opinions about the situation. Edric watched this with his lips pressed together and his chest shaking slightly with something he was not going to allow to become audible, because he was a serious man in a difficult landscape and he was going to maintain some dignity. He had decided, for at least the duration of this particular encounter. The silver one, undisturbed by the chaos to its left, continued breathing against his coat button with its eyes half closed. By degrees, and it happened gradually enough that he couldn't have marked the exact moment of transition, the energy wound down. The larger one found a position pressed against his shoulder and stopped moving. The second, having untangled itself from the collision with considerable grievance, and finding that there was nowhere immediately obvious to relocate to, settled against his stomach with the air of someone making the best of a situation they have not fully forgiven. The silver one was already still. The storm continued its work overhead. He could hear the pine moving above him, not the sharp crack and crash of breaking branches, but the deeper, rhythmic sway of the massive trunk itself, that barely perceptible motion that meant the roots, deep in the mountain rock, were doing what roots were built to do: holding. The fire had dropped lower, feeding itself down to coals that threw less light but more sustained heat, and the darkness around the camp had deepened into the full, absolute dark of a stormy mountain night with neither moon nor stars available to soften it. Beneath the old wool blanket, with his arm curved around the outside of the small pile of warm bodies pressed against him, the temperature had become something genuinely comfortable. The shared heat of four living creatures in an insulated space, even a modest insulation, even an imperfect one, was not nothing. It was in fact enough for him, enough clearly for them. He listened to them sleep. The sound came on gradually, the way the silence of exhaustion becomes a sound of its own once you stop expecting quiet and start actually listening. It was not quite a purr. Purring was a cat's mechanism, a specifically feline feedback loop of vibration and breathing, and what he was hearing was built on different architecture entirely. It was lower than a purr. It sat in the chest rather than the throat, a resonance more than a sound felt as much as heard, a soft, rolling vibration that he could feel through his side and his arm as much as he could hear it in the close air beneath the blanket. And it was not quite a growl, because a growl carried intention in it, a directed quality, and this carried nothing of the sort. It was directionless content. The sound of a mechanism running smoothly, of a system that has found its equilibrium and is simply quietly running. He decided, lying there in the dark with his arm around three sleeping dragons and his shoulder carrying a small char mark that was going to require a patch, that this was the sound of contentment. Whatever word existed in the language these creatures spoke, if they spoke any language that had words, this was the sound that meant enough. This is enough. This is, right now, exactly enough. He did not sleep yet. He was not ready to sleep yet, and he had learned long ago not to force sleep when his body was not asking for it, to trust that the wakefulness was there for a reason even if he couldn't immediately articulate what the reason was. So he lay awake and tended the edges of his awareness gently, the way you tend a fire you're not ready to let go out. He adjusted his arm once, a slow, careful repositioning that took nearly a full minute to complete, moving 1 degree at a time, because the larger one's wing had come partially unfolded in sleep, and the primary joint was bent at an angle that looked, to his eye, like it might become uncomfortable. He worked his hand under the blanket with the patience of a man diffusing something delicate and shifted the wing into a more natural position, the membrane settling back against the small back with a faint papery sound. The hatchling stirred slightly, made a sound that was not quite a syllable but had the cadence of one, and then went back under into sleep without surfacing. The silver one had moved in sleep, had shifted somehow without waking, until its head was resting in the curve between his chest and his arm, the pale scales warm now against his skin where his coat had fallen open slightly. He looked down at it for a long moment, at the faint luminescence of the silver scales and the small, shut amber eyes and the rapid, delicate flutter of the breathing. He thought about the nest on the ridgeline. He thought about the mother somewhere in the dark above the storm, hunting unaware. He thought about morning and what it would bring and the various practical complications of his situation, and he thought about all of these things from a certain comfortable distance, because they were morning thoughts and morning was still hours away, and right now the only relevant facts were these. The fire was still going, the wind was still howling, the storm was still doing what it intended to do. And here, in this specific small space beneath an old wool blanket at the base of an ancient pine in the Ashfin Mountains, everything that needed to be warm was warm. He had not planned for company on this journey. He had, in fact, actively arranged his life to minimize the kind of company that complicated his movements and claimed portions of his attention and required things from him on schedules that were not his own. He was a man who traveled alone by preference and choice, who found in solitude not loneliness but a particular, sustainable freedom that other arrangements had never quite provided. He looked at the three small bodies settled against him, breathing in the slow, contented rhythm of the deeply asleep, making their soft rolling sound of enough, enough, enough. He smiled in the dark, where no one could see it but the dying fire. The best things in his experience had very rarely arrived according to plan. They arrived instead in storms at the wrong time, through gaps in the careful arrangements you had made for your life, small and cold and trembling with their palms, metaphorically speaking, turned upward. And the only question that ever really mattered when they did was whether you were the kind of person who lifted the edge of the blanket. He closed his eyes, and this time sleep came easily, curling in around the edges of his awareness the way warmth curls in around cold. And he let it come, and he let himself go under, with three small heartbeats pressed against his side keeping time with his own. The morning after and what was left behind. Dawn came pale and clean, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a brilliant, aching blue. It arrived without fanfare, the way the best dawns did, not with the dramatic, gradual theater of a sky slowly warming through orange and pink and gold, but with a quiet, absolute quality, as if the world had simply decided in the space between one moment and the next to be different. The violence of the night was gone. Completely, almost insultingly gone, as if the storm had spent everything it had and then retreated without ceremony, leaving behind a silence so total and a sky so clean that the contrast with the hours preceding it was almost difficult to process. The blue overhead was the particular blue that only came after a serious storm had done its work, not the soft, hazy blue of an ordinary winter morning, but something deeper and more saturated, the blue of something that had been thoroughly wrung out and hung up and dried into its truest color. Aching was the right word for it. It was beautiful in the specific, almost painful way of things that arrive just after something hard, where the beauty and the relief are so tangled together that you cannot experience one without feeling the other underneath it. The forest had changed overnight. Every surface that the storm had touched, which was to say every surface that existed, wore a thin, perfect coat of ice. Not the thick, accumulated ice of a sustained freeze, but the delicate, translucent film of water that had been wind-driven against bark and needle and stone, and then locked in place the moment the temperature dropped deep enough. The ancient pine above Edric's camp wore it like a second skin, every needle outlined in clear ice that caught the new light and held it, so that the whole enormous tree seemed to be quietly, privately luminous, as if lit from within by something small and steady. The undergrowth around the camp had been transformed into a collection of tiny sculptures, each dead leaf, each dried seed head, each blade of frost-silvered grass preserved inside its own transparent shell, rendered suddenly and briefly precious by the accident of a cold night and moving water. The campfire had died sometime in the small hours. The coals had given their last heat silently without waking him and now sat cold and white-gray in their ring of stones, the oilskin tarp above them beaded with the ice that had condensed from the steam of their dying. The camp was cold. The air was cold in the specific, sharp way of mountain mornings after storms, not the damp, penetrating cold of the night that had preceded it, but a dry, crystalline cold that sat in the nostrils and the lungs like something clean, like something that had been filtered down to its essential nature and was presenting itself without apology. Edric did not wake gradually. He had never been a gradual waker, This was another thing that years of outdoor living had adjusted in him. The slow, reluctant crawl toward consciousness that belonged to warm beds and safe rooms was a luxury that had simply been trained out of him by necessity. When he woke completely all at once, his awareness arriving fully assembled and already taking stock of his surroundings before he had consciously decided to be awake. Eyes open, brain engaged, processing. The first thing he processed was the weight. Not the weight of the blanket, which he knew, not the weight of his own body against the bedroll, which he also knew. This was different, distributed, specific, and unmistakably alive. 3 distinct points of pressure across his chest, arranged in a loose row from his sternum toward his left shoulder, each one warm in the particular, focused way of small bodies that had spent the night generating and conserving heat with commendable efficiency. 3 small weights. 3. He did not startle. He did not move. He simply lay still for one long, deliberate moment and let the full memory of the night arrive in order. The storm, the fire, the amber eyes at the edge of his blanket, the small foot placed on the wool, the silver one behind the mossy root, and then he tilted his chin down and looked. They were sitting on him. Not beside him, not pressed against him as they had been in sleep, but actually sitting on him, upright, arranged across the width of his chest with the composed, considered posture of creatures who had arrived at this position intentionally and felt no need to explain themselves. They were sitting in a row, close enough that their scale-covered shoulders were nearly touching, all 3 faces angled downward, all 3 pairs of amber eyes fixed on his face with an attention so complete and so solemn that his first, unfiltered impression was of a tribunal that had convened while he was unconscious and was now prepared to deliver its findings. The largest was on his left, nearest his shoulder. Its wings were held slightly away from its body, not spread, not folded entirely flat, but occupying some intermediate position that gave it a slightly wider, slightly more significant silhouette as if it were framing itself deliberately. There was something in this posture that he had no exact word for, a readiness, perhaps, held carefully at equilibrium, poised between 2 possible futures without having committed to either. The amber eyes above those half-spread wings were clear and bright and deeply alert, carrying none of the dulled exhaustion he had seen in them the night before. Warmth and sleep had restored something fundamental. The eyes that watched him now were the eyes of a creature that was fully, completely present. The second occupied the middle of the row with the unself-conscious ease of a creature that had claimed its space and found it adequate. It sat with the slightly rounded posture of something that has recently eaten well, which it had not yet, but which had at minimum slept well, and its tail had curled around to rest against his sternum with a proprietorial comfort that was either unself-conscious or very deliberately comfortable, depending on how one read it. The gaze it fixed on his face was less evaluative than the largest's, more simply attentive, the gaze of something that is watching to see what happens next and is mildly curious about it. And the silver one. The silver one had its head tilted. Not slightly tilted, not the casual angle of a creature momentarily adjusting its perspective. Tilted with intention, with the focused, thinking quality of something working through a problem it finds genuinely interesting. The pale head was angled a full 30 degrees to the right, the amber eyes narrowed fractionally, the tiny brow ridge drawn down in concentration. It looked, Edric thought, like someone reading a document in a language they mostly spoke and trying to parse a particular word that was giving them trouble. It looked like a question that had not yet found its form. He looked at all 3 of them, the row of solemn faces looking down at his, the half-spread wings, the tilted silver head. Something rose in his chest, warm and quick and entirely genuine, the specific upwelling of feeling that comes when something is both deeply absurd and deeply wonderful simultaneously. When the world presents you with something so perfectly, accidentally right that the only adequate response is the one that bypasses all your careful, maintained composure and simply arrives on its own terms. He laughed. It was a quiet laugh. He was still a man who had spent 3 decades developing the habit of quiet in wild places. And that habit did not disappear simply because he was lying in his bedroll at dawn with 3 dragons on his chest, but it was full. Real. The kind of laugh that comes from the actual center of a person rather than the surface of them, that carries in it no performance and no audience awareness and nothing but the pure, unmediated response to a moment that has earned it. It moved through his chest, and he felt the 3 small bodies on him register it, felt the subtle shift in their postures as the movement beneath them became something different than breathing, and he watched their expressions with the laugh still in his eyes. The largest tilted its own head slightly, mirroring, perhaps unconsciously, the silver one's posture, as if the laugh were a piece of information it was trying to classify. The silver one's tilt deepened by approximately 10 more degrees. He reached up slowly, telegraphing the movement clearly, bringing his hand up into their line of sight before it arrived anywhere near them, and let his knuckles rest near the largest one's snout in the gesture that had worked the night before, the offering of familiar information, the scent that had already passed one round of evaluation and might be permitted to pass another. The largest one did not hesitate this time. It bent its head and pressed its nose against his knuckle with a directness that was entirely different from the careful, tentative investigation of the night before. This was recognition, not inquiry. The nostrils worked briefly, confirming what they already knew, and then the small head pushed slightly harder against his hand with a pressure that was almost not quite, but almost something you might call affectionate if you were the kind of person who was willing to apply that word to a 2-day-old dragon sitting on your chest at dawn. Edric was, it turned out, exactly that kind of person. The morning unfolded the way the best mornings did, without agenda, without the pressure of anything that needed to happen by a specific time, with only the loose, generous shape of hours that belonged to themselves. He rebuilt the fire first, because that was the practical requirement of a cold morning, and the 3 hatchlings supervised this process from a distance of approximately 4 feet, with the serious, concentrated attention of creatures who found fire both fascinating and slightly alarming, and had not yet resolved this tension. When the first small flame caught, the largest spread its wings fully for the first time since he'd seen it, not in preparation for flight, not in alarm, just in what appeared to be involuntary response, wings going wide at the sight of fire the way a person might unconsciously lean toward warmth, something ancient and wired in expressing itself without consultation. He watched this with quiet delight and said nothing, and fed the fire carefully until it was established and steady, and then sat back on his bedroll and opened his pack. The dried fish was the decision that revealed their characters most clearly, he would think afterward. He had 3 small portions of it, wrapped in oilskin at the bottom of his pack, not much, not a significant portion of his stores, and he surrendered them without deliberation to the 3 creatures who had decided, apparently, that he was theirs for the morning. He laid the pieces on a flat stone near the fire, and then he leaned back and watched what happened. What happened was illuminating. The largest went first, naturally. It approached the stone with the same decisive confidence it had applied to every situation since the moment it had placed its foot on his blanket, assessed the offering with a single, efficient sniff, and then consumed its portion in 4 bites that demonstrated an anatomical capability that was frankly impressive in something the size of a large kitten. The efficiency was almost mechanical, not because the creature lacked enthusiasm, but because it was genuinely hungry and enthusiasm and efficiency had reached an agreement and decided to cooperate. It cleaned its portion from the stone in under 15 seconds, sat back, and regarded the stone with the expression of something that has completed a task and is assessing whether additional tasks present themselves. The second approached with more ceremony. Circled the stone once, examined the fish from 2 additional angles, looked up at Edric as if checking for contextual information, looked back at the fish, and then proceeded to eat with an enthusiasm that was significantly less efficient than its siblings. There was more lateral movement involved, more active engagement with the process, a physicality to its eating that got fish everywhere within a 6-inch radius and on at least 2 of its own scales and seemed to cause it no concern whatsoever. The silver one ate last, and it ate slowly, and it ate with its eyes half closed in an expression that communicated, across whatever distance lay between its nervous system and his reading of it, something like genuine, specific pleasure. It ate the way someone eats when they are aware of what they are eating and are choosing to be present to it. When it finished, it sat for a moment with its eyes still half closed, and then it licked the stone. He kept his face entirely neutral. He pressed his lips together and looked at the tree line and breathed carefully through his nose, and he maintained his composure, and he was proud of himself for it. The satchel came next, not by his invitation, but by the natural progression of 3 curious, recently fed creatures, discovering that the large, interesting-smelling bag leaning against the pine root was not locked, and was not defended and contained within it a remarkable variety of objects that rewarded investigation. He noticed the incursion when he looked up from stoking the fire, and found the silver one halfway inside the main compartment with its haunches in the air and its tail waving, conducting what appeared to be a thorough internal census. He moved with the quick, practiced calm of a man who had learned that sudden motion around animals caused more problems than it solved, and reached the satchel in 4 unhurried steps, and began the process of extracting his materials from small, curious, surprisingly dexterous claws. The 3 glass vials were the most urgent priority. He got 2 of them cleanly, spotted them in the silver one's grasp before they left the bag, and retrieved them with a gentle, firm persistence that the silver one accepted with the resigned air of someone who acknowledges they have been fairly caught. The 3rd vial made it further than it should have, ending up on the forest floor 6 inches from the edge of a tree root, rolling in a gentle arc toward a collision that his hand arrived to prevent with approximately half a second to spare. He held the vial up and looked at it, a tincture of ashwood bark and dried yarrow, 2 weeks of careful collection, irreplaceable in the short term, and then he looked at the silver one, which was regarding him from the top of the satchel with the tilted head expression that he was coming to understand, meant it was processing new information and had not yet issued a verdict. He put the vials in his coat pocket, he reclosed the satchel flap and weighted it with a stone. He sat back down. The silver one tilted its head the other direction and considered the weighted stone with an evaluative expression that made him suspect, not for the first time, that it was smarter than the situation strictly called for. The beetle appeared sometime around mid-morning. He did not see where it came from. One moment it did not exist as a relevant fact in the landscape of the camp, and the next moment it was making its way with unhurried purpose across a patch of frost-silvered grass near the tree line, its shell catching the morning light in a dull, iridescent glimmer, entirely unaware that its journey had just become the most significant event occurring within a 12-foot radius. The second hatchling saw it first. He watched the precise moment of discovery with the attentive pleasure of someone watching a performance they hadn't known to expect. The second had been investigating the texture of the moss on the pine root with its nose when something in its peripheral vision apparently registered, and the whole body went still in a way that was qualitatively different from ordinary stillness, not the stillness of rest but the stillness of focus, of a predator instinct coming online for perhaps the first time outside of whatever it had been practicing in the egg. The head lowered. The tail extended behind it, rigid like a counterweight or a rudder. The amber eyes locked. Then the largest saw it. Then the silver one. And then all three of them were doing the same thing, low, focused, tail extended, eyes fixed. And the beetle continued its oblivious transit across the frostgrass with the magnificent indifference of something that has not yet understood the nature of its situation. What followed was not efficient. It was not coordinated. It did not demonstrate the apex predator heritage that would one day make creatures like these the most significant animals in the Ashfin range. What it demonstrated, instead, was the endearing, chaotic energy of very young things encountering instinct for the first time and discovering that instinct and execution are not in fact the same thing. The largest went first and overshot, landing 6 inches past the beetle with both front feet and skidding on the frozen grass in a way that sent it sideways. The beetle changed direction. The second came in from the left at speed and collided with its sibling rather than the beetle, producing a brief tangle and a burst of mutual indignation. The silver one, which had approached from the right with more measured care, arrived at the beetle's last known position to find it vacant, stood in the empty space with its head tilted, and then located the beetle 3 inches to its left and regarded it with an expression that suggested it was revising its tactical approach. Edric sat on his bedroll and watched all of this with his arms resting on his knees and a feeling in his chest that was large and warm and entirely content to simply be there without being examined. He watched the beetle evade 3 dragons for 11 minutes. He watched the hatchlings develop in real time something approaching a rudimentary strategy, not through communication exactly, but through the accumulated learning of repeated failure, each unsuccessful attempt generating some small adjustment in the next. He watched the silver one particularly processing the problem with that characteristic tilted head focus, repositioning itself with each attempt in a way that was incrementally more thoughtful. He was still watching when the call came. He heard it before he consciously registered hearing it, felt it, more accurately as a vibration in the sternum before it resolved into sound, the specific bone-deep resonance of a voice built for distances that dwarfed the small hollow where his camp sat. It rolled down from the mountain ridge above the treeline like weather, like the leading edge of something vast and purposeful, aimed with precision at something small. Low and rolling and resonant, carrying in its frequency the particular quality of something that does not need to be loud to be heard everywhere that matters. His first purely physiological response was the straightening of his spine. Not from fear, he was familiar enough with fear to know the difference between his body's response to genuine threat and its response to the proximity of something simply, fundamentally large. This was the latter. The sound carried authority in its vibration the way certain silences carried meaning, not a message exactly, but a presence, a declaration of existence so complete that the air had no choice but to carry it. Their mothers. He looked at the 3 hatchlings. The transformation was instantaneous and total. The beetle had ceased to exist as a relevant fact. The frost grass, the camp, the fire, the morning, all of it had been replaced, in the space between one breath and the next, by a single overwhelming signal that rewrote everything. 3 heads had snapped upward simultaneously, with a synchronicity so perfect it seemed choreographed. All 3 pairs of amber eyes fixing on the ridge above the treeline with an intensity that made every previous expression of focus he had witnessed from them look casual by comparison. The largest was the first to answer. The cry it gave was nothing like the tentative between a chirpand growl sound it had made at the edge of his blanket in the dark. This was a fully committed sound, sharp and high and carrying, shaped by instinct into exactly what it needed to be, the sound that said, "Here, we are here, we heard you," and it came out of the small body with a force that seemed almost too large for the chest producing it. Before the last note of it had finished, the wings were fully spread, and for the first time since he had seen those wings they looked like what they were, not vestigial remnants, not decorative structures, not the sad, damp, folded things that had been pressed against small backs in the cold, but actual wings. The primary equipment of something built for air, the membrane catching the morning light in a translucent gleam as the hatchling launched itself upward with a confidence that stopped his breath for a moment. The second followed before the first had cleared 6 feet of altitude, launched itself without the cry, without the preparation, simply went, with the immediate, total commitment of something that has just received the only instruction it has ever truly needed. And then there were two. Edric and the Silver One. The Silver One had not moved. It was still on the frostgrass where the beetle chase had ended, its wings fully spread like its siblings had been, its face angled upward, but its feet were on the ground, and its eyes, when they came down from the ridgeline, came down to him. He met its gaze without flinching, without looking away, without filling the moment with anything that didn't belong in it. He simply held the silver gaze and let the moment be what it was, which was something he did not have a precise word for, but which felt like a conversation conducted entirely without language, and which felt, underneath all its other qualities, like something real. The Silver One looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. Not the tilted head assessment, not the evaluating sobriety of the morning row across his chest, not the focused intensity of the beetle hunt. Something quieter than those. Something that existed in a register below intention, below decision, in the territory where creatures simply are what they are and cannot help but show it. He thought he was not certain, he held the thought loosely, that he was seeing the specific, unarticulable feeling of a creature standing at the edge of leaving something that had unexpectedly been good. He had been that creature. He knew the feeling from the inside well enough to recognize it from the outside. He held its gaze and then slowly he nodded. It was not a large movement. It was not meant to be. Just the slight, deliberate inclination of his head, a single, quiet, downward movement that carried in it everything he had to say, which was, "Go on then, you're all right now. You were all right last night and you are all right this morning and you will be all right on the mountain where you belong and you do not need to stay for my sake and I do not need you to stay," and this was enough. This was exactly and completely enough. The Silver One held his gaze for a moment longer. One breath, too. And then it chirruped. The sound it made was nothing like the involuntary clicking of a body too cold to control itself, nothing like the small, uncertain sounds it had made in the dark while he was still a stranger with an upturned palm. This was deliberate. He was certain of that, certain in the way he was certain of things he couldn't prove but knew regardless, in the bone knowledge way that lived beneath argument. Sharp and bright and clean as the morning air, one single note placed into the silence with the precision of something chosen. Not a call, not an answer to the mother's voice, not an accident. A statement. A period placed at the end of a sentence. A thing said clearly to him specifically before the leaving. He would not claim to know what it meant in any language he could name. He would only say that it hit him somewhere in the chest, that single bright sound, and lodged there with the particular permanence of things that arrive without warning and stay without permission. Then the silver wings opened to their full span, pale and luminous in the morning light, the membrane catching the blue sky above and holding it, translucent and beautiful, and the Silver One lifted itself from the frost grass and rose, following the line its siblings had taken, climbing the cold, clean air in a spiral that carried it up and up toward the ridgeline until the blue sky swallowed it entirely, and it was gone. The quiet that followed was the loudest quiet he had heard in years. He sat with it. He did not rush to fill it, did not reach for his pack or begin the practical business of breaking camp, did not do any of the dozen things that needed doing before he could continue his journey. He sat on his bedroll with his burned blanket folded in his lap. He had folded it without thinking at some point in the morning, his hands doing the familiar task while the rest of him was elsewhere, and he looked at the empty sky above the treeline and he let the quiet be what it was. The char mark on the blanket was roughly the size of a coin. He found it with his thumb without looking, tracing the edge of the burn where the wool had melted clean rather than frayed. The heat had been too quick and too focused for fraying. He pressed his thumb against it and held it there, a small, tactile fact, proof of something. He was not sad, he wanted to be precise about that, even in the privacy of his own assessment. What he felt was not the hollow absence of grief, did not have grief-specific weight the way grief pulled downward and inward. What he felt was full. Strangely, specifically full in the way you feel after something complete, after an experience that arrived with a beginning and a middle and an end, and delivered all three cleanly and then closed. There was something sweet in it, yes, and something that had the faint, familiar ache of release. But underneath both of those things was a bedrock of something he could only call gratitude, plain, direct, uncomplicated gratitude for a cold night, and a storm that had been terrible and a fire that had been stubborn and three small creatures that had followed the warmth through the dark and found him, and had trusted him, and had slept against his heartbeat and eaten his dried fish and stolen his glass vials, and chased a beetle across the frostgrass while the morning grew golden around them all. He looked at the empty sky until he was finished looking at it. Then he rolled the bedroll with his usual economy of motion and tied it to his pack. He gathered his oilskin tarp and folded it, shook the ice crystals from its surface, stowed it. He stamped out the remnants of the fire and scattered the cold white coals, leaving the stone ring as he had found it, a small courtesy to whoever came next. He shouldered his satchel, felt the familiar weight of it settle against his back, and adjusted the straps. He looked up at the ridgeline one more time. The sky above it was empty and blue and blazing, the sun fully above the horizon now, the ice in the trees around him beginning to tick and drip as the warmth reached it, 1,000 tiny sounds of winter yielding incrementally to morning. Nothing moved against the blue except the light. He turned and walked south into the clean, cold morning, through the transformed forest with its ice-outlined needles catching the light in thousands of tiny brilliances, his breath fogging in the still air ahead of him, his boots finding their rhythm against the frozen ground. He carried the burned blanket folded in his pack, and the char mark in the wool, and the weight of a single bright chirp placed deliberately into the silence before leaving, and the memory of 3 pairs of amber eyes arranged in a solemn row across his chest at dawn, watching his face as if it were something worth watching. He carried the understanding, which was not new exactly, but which the night had pressed back into clarity the way a thumb pressed into soft wax restores a shape that had blurred, that some gifts were not designed to be kept. That keeping was not always the point, and was sometimes the thing that made you miss the point entirely. That the hands through which the best things passed were not diminished by the passing, but were instead marked by it in ways that mattered, shaped, subtly and permanently, by the fact of what they had held, and what they had been willing to hold, and what they had known when the time came to release. He walked on through the brilliant, ice-bright morning, still smiling. He was the kind of man who understood these things. He had always been that kind of man. But today, walking south through the Ashfin forest with the sky blazing cold and blue overhead and the mountain at his back, he was more certain of it than he had ever been, and more glad, quietly and specifically glad, that he was. The world had plenty of people who could hold things tightly. It needed now and then the ones who knew how to open their hands.